All right, welcome to our quick review of sectors of the economy. We're going to introduce this as part of our unit on agriculture, and we're going to continue using it as we talk about economic development and industrialization. The same information applies, quite frankly, we talked about it a little bit with the population unit, and we're going to keep coming back to a lot of this information throughout the course here. And the first thing I want to point out to you, because I think it matters, is when you look at our first slide here, what we've got are two very different pictures of gravel manufacturing. And in one of them, it's not very mechanized at all. Really, it's basically a person gathering gravel up into a basket and then delivering it somewhere else to be used or spread or things like that. And quite frankly, it's probably made by dropping rocks on each other versus and that's in India, by the way, versus our gravel factory here in the United States in Utah. And in this, it's very mechanized, and the machines are doing a lot of the work, and the gravel's probably being sorted by size and all kinds of spiffy cool things like that. So we talk about sectors of the economy. The key point that I want you to get is the primary sector, which is actually, it says agriculture on this slide, but it's really a lot more than agriculture. It's really anything to do with the earth and taking things out of the earth. So agriculture falls into here, mining falls into here, logging falls into here. Okay, anything to do with that taking resources out of the earth. Okay, secondary is manufacturing. And what we mean by manufacturing is taking those elements from the primary economic activity and turning it into goods that can then be sold in a marketplace. Okay, so for instance, mining gold is a primary economic activity. Turning the gold into a ring that could then be sold, that's a secondary economic activity. Okay. And then tertiary economic activities, these are services. So to continue with our gold example, right? So our primary producer, he mined the gold. Our secondary producer turned our gold into a ring. And our tertiary, or our third level producer, is going to take that ring and sell it to somebody, maybe as a wedding band or something similar. Okay, so it's that service piece. And each step you're going a little further along in the process. Tertiary, though, that services piece, that's really super huge and broad when we talk about just services in general, okay? And it literally accounts for everybody from the sales clerk to teachers to Google, and everything in between, CEOs, right? Everything in between. So it's a huge, huge sector. Economists and some economic geographers break that down a little bit further, and they look at what they call quaternary services, which is to say information services. So these are people who produce or curate information, such as yours truly. And then we've got quinary, which is management services. And management services, these are the people who were supervising, who were keeping track of everything, telling people what to do and managing all of those different layers and really kind of keeping everything else in line. Now that being said, the quaternary and the quinary are not generally agreed upon by geographers, so that is something that's important to note. Okay, so those last two layers not generally agreed upon, which is important to note, but it's still, when we're talking about where we see what types of development, it's important to remember those quaternary and quinary services, because that's going to make a big difference in terms of what we see where. So when we talk about the structural change in economies across time, what we're really looking at, and you can see our times on the bottom, okay, so our pre-industrial, industrial, post-industrial stages. There's countries at each of those stages. And then on our y-axis, what we're looking at is approximately what percentage of the workforce, okay? And the division of labor, it's important to note here, you'll see this when we fill in the graph, really varies a lot depending on what level of economic development we're at. So first, we're going to look at our primary. economic activities. And what we can see as we look at the graph is that across time we go from a lot of people being involved in those primary economic activities to increasingly few people until we get to our post-industrial or our more developed countries where very few people are. Okay, and just to give you some idea, if we look at lesser developed areas, say of Africa, we might see upwards of 80–90% in that primary economic activity field, versus in the United States, it's somewhere around 3–5%. So it's just a much different number. When we look at our secondary activity, what we actually see is kind of interesting because it's not a straight line. We start out with very few people in that secondary. Remember, secondary is manufacturing. And so in our pre-industrial economies, relatively few people, right? We've always got some people making stuff. But then as we develop, that number goes up, and now our newly industrializing countries, or our industrial economies, there's pretty fair number of people, usually tops out somewhere around 40–60%, somewhere in that range. And then as we get further and further industrialized and the cost of labor goes up, what we actually see is fewer and fewer people doing it, but still higher than where it started. With our tertiary economic activities, what we see is actually the exact opposite, more or less, of what we saw with our primary economic activities, which is to say we started out with very few people doing service-based industries. And the more we develop, the more people that do them, until ultimately what we end up with at our post-industrial, more developed countries, which this is very true here in the US, is that there's more people doing service activities than there are doing primary economic activity. Okay, and then what we've got is our quaternary, and you don't even see a whole lot of people engaged in, very, very few people engaged in quaternary economic activities until you start industrializing. And then that need for information and information services becomes very important, as you need a workforce that can read and write and do the things that it needs to do in order to be able to operate the machinery to engage in the manufacturing. Okay, so a slightly different way of looking at this, and this particular diagram comes out of the Fellman text for our class, which is not one of the ones we're using, but it is one of the other textbooks that we could have used. And what you'll notice is across time, transportation and communication become increasingly important. Okay, so in primary economic activities where we're in agriculture, where we're gathering things, right? So picking fruit, for instance, would fall under the gathering, or we're extracting things. Transportation is not necessarily, it's important, but it's not as important to our economic activity. As we go into manufacturing, however, right, we're processing and we're building and things like that, that transportation becomes increasingly important, as does communication, because we've got to communicate between our suppliers and our factories, and then our factories and our audiences, or our consumers, sorry, is really what I meant. And we continue to see that as we go, right? With tertiary economic activities, transportation becomes more important still as we get into retail, and now we've got to be able to deliver what we need all over, right? Ultimately to wholesalers and then on to retail. All right, we start to see the development of personal and professional services. And these are everything from maids to hairstylists, personal assistants, and the like. Okay, and then on up, when we're talking about quaternary and quinary, not only is transportation important, partially at those levels, largely because we need to get the types of things that people have made for us to buy. But what really becomes increasingly important at those levels is communication and the ability to communicate quickly. And this is where, when we're talking about economic development, where things like the internet become significantly more important, access to reliable telephone service and things of that nature really become very important in terms of the economy. I mean, stop and think about what would happen in the US if one of the major fiber optic cables got cut and nobody could get internet. How panicked you guys would be. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get rid of that quinary one for the moment. When we're talking about the global economy, what we want to look at is the spatial division of labor taken across borders. So taken across the world, and that internationalized, right? That prefix inter means between or across, between nations. Okay, and then the spatial division of labor is the tendency for certain sectors of the economy to concentrate in different regions. So for instance, primary economic activities tend to develop in LDCs and NICs, sorry, less developed countries and newly industrializing countries, mostly in those less developed countries though. And then our secondary economic activities focus mostly in our newly industrializing countries where labor is still relatively cheap, okay? Tertiary tends to focus mostly on the higher end newly industrializing countries, and then our more developed countries, right? And ultimately, our quaternary activities focus almost entirely in more developed countries, right? Apple might manufacture their products in China and other parts of Asia, right? That's that secondary activity. Notice it's occurring in industrializing countries like Korea, South Korea, or China. They sell them worldwide. The biggest audiences for them, of course, being in the United States, being in those industrializing countries, right, those newly industrializing countries. But at the end of the day, all of Apple's management, all of their research, all of their development programs, all of the idea kind of stuff, all happens in more developed countries. Okay, and that's what we mean when we're talking about different sectors to concentrate in different regions. So that was our quick review of sectors of the economy. Again, a few major things to know. One is that primary economic activities, that's extractive stuff, that's gathering stuff, that's agriculture and the like. Secondary sectors are manufacturing, so it's taking those products generated by the primary sector and turning them into goods or services that people might be, turning them specifically into goods, I should say, that people might be willing to buy. And then tertiary, which is a super broad category, are all those services. So we take those products that the manufacturers have made in the secondary sectors, and now we're selling them, and we're providing all kinds of other services. And with each of those types of economic development, what you tend to see is people, or countries really, cluster into one area over the others as they, depending on their level of overall economic development. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to come and see me. And otherwise, I will see you the next time we have class.